Welcome, everybody, to our talk today on app modernization at scale, building a plan for 600% faster cloud native transformation. So, really, all about application modernization, how we can accelerate that process and perhaps some of the hurdles. But we'll talk about that a little bit more once we get into the webinar itself. Well, my name is Kevin. I will be your host and your presenter for today's webinar. I've been working in the field of DevOps development and continuous improvement and testing for the last decade or so, really across Fortune 500 companies, in finance, retail, healthcare, logistics, and all that, really to remove bottlenecks and accelerate their processes of getting idea all the way to production, essentially, right? So, and that involves things such as looking at their pipelines, looking at the application architecture, and also things like infrastructure. So, a lot of the things that we'll be covering off today as well in our webinar. Let's have a look at what we will be covering off today. So a few things that we want to make sure that I convey in today's webinar is really some of the considerations for application modernization, right? Excuse me, the different approaches, whether we rehost, replatform, et cetera, et cetera. Common hurdles that you'll run into in app modernization. Why? How do we get around it? Scaling your containerization and application modernization with AMMP, which is our application modernization and migration platform, and how to ensure that your application modernization actually gets done instead of being endlessly put in the back burner. So whether you're considering the benefits of application modernization, whether you're currently actually starting the process or you're in process and it's been trying it for quite some time and running into bottlenecks, hopefully the information over here would help you get along the way there. So I guess the very first question that we may have is, why do we want to do application modernization? There are talks of, we've got to do it. There could be multiple reasons. And it can be on different facets, right? And you may be thinking about it on, what are the benefits? What can you pitch? So this is one of them, right? So this is from the State of DevOps report. It's been going on for a couple of years now, and the latest one, things obviously gets measured to our four commonly held DevOps metrics that we want to measure against, which came out of the DORA folks as well, that does the DevOps State of DevOps reports, and that is in the fields of deployment frequency, how often you could deploy to production, your lead time for changes from ideation to production, change failure rate, right? How much of the code that you push into production actually has issues if you haven't caught it before in the earlier stages, and the time to restore, the MTTR, right, of services. So if there's any failures in production, how long does it take to recover from that failure? So as you can see from the chart over here, in the performance level, they kind of broke it down into four different levels. The elite performers, or those that are higher performing, tend to have a shorter deployment frequency, lead time for changes, it has a lower change failure rate, and also has a quicker time to restore, right? So you see those metrics, obviously lower then becomes better. And see that the most of us, by the looks of it, is kind of in the high to medium area, right? There are still some that are in the lower area and kind of equal in the elite section. But you can see that in order to achieve these, you do need to have higher agility. And to achieve higher agility, you need to have architectures and infrastructure to support that. And that is really one of the reasons why most folks want to do application modernization, right? It is that agility of deployment and change, right? Obviously, there's also the security aspects, but let's focus on that, the flexibility and agility section for a little bit more, right? So when we talk about application modernization, it's kind of on three different levels. If we think about it, it's not just an application rewrite, because if the ultimate goal is to achieve agility and security, you need to have the other things that support it, right? So there's your application architecture level, there is your infrastructure level underneath that, and then there's your deployment methodology, and your pipelines, your planning stages, all that kind of stuff. Right. So on the leftmost is our traditional method. So you have a monolithic application, everything is one, JBoss application, perhaps that is connected to a database. It is on your bare metal servers, and we go and deploy a waterfall method, right? So things are planned out throughout the year. It's relatively static, and if there's changes, we can do a change request on that kind of stuff. Least agile, right? Least flexible. So then in recent years, we then moved on to a more flexible SOA architecture where everything's then governed by ESB, and then you got the services at the back end. Everything's deployed onto virtual machines, so it's easier to scale and deploy compute as needed. And then we adopt an agile methodology, right? Go into sprints, everything's 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and therefore we change things within 2 or 3 weeks. So it's a lot quicker. And then now for even more flexibility, we then move into the microservices architecture where every single bit of your old services in the SOA architecture can then be broken down into individual services by function. And this way, if you need to change something, you don't have to change the entire service block. You're changing the microservice. And then therefore, once again, gain more flexibility. And by that, we need to have a cloud ready architecture, which really means containerization as well as using the cloud infrastructure, whether it's a private cloud or a public cloud. So this way, your individual microservices don't affect anything else, and you have isolation. And then we employ, a DevOps methodology where you have continuous feedback, continuous improvement, continuous delivery, continuous integration. So everything is much more ad hoc almost by sense of it, right? There is still planning involved, but it's more flexible in the methods, right? So when we're talking about application modernization, a lot of folks kind of think of it as, you know what, I want to move my SOA architecture on virtual machines into microservices on container clouds. But that's what happens if we're still on monolith? Because there are going to be folks that are still on there. So we want to kind of expand the scope of application modernization to not just look at those going from a services architecture to a microservices architecture, but more so, how can we help automate some of the processes going from a monolith architecture to perhaps a microservices or containered um, method as well, right? So you don't have to go through step by step and again accelerate your process there. Uh, and if you think about this, then one of the big things that you have to look out for or consider, and on top of just looking at your application architecture, is really the flexible infrastructure, right? How do we make sure that the infrastructure that you have can actually support your architecture there? And that's kind of reflected in this year's State of DevOps report as well, where when you look at moving your applications to the cloud, whether private or public or hybrid, um, most organizations look at a lift and shift, right? And that's a good first step because that means your infrastructure is um, somewhat more controllable, right, than having individual servers and being kind of tied to it. But that's just the beginning, right? If you do want to take your workloads and then modernize it, what you really want to do is look at refactoring them to make use of more flexible infrastructure, right? Being able to scale up with your containerization when you, let's say, if you use Kubernetes or things like that as well, your horizontal scaling, your vertical scaling. How do you utilize all that, right? And you see that having that flexible infrastructure on top of your architecture change and using the different cloud types, you can see that the different cloud types actually don't entirely dictate performance. What I mean by that is, if you look at this section over here, moving to public cloud, if you just move to public cloud, your organizational performance and your team performance is not directly um, related to just that public cloud move. There is also the additional thing of the flexible infrastructure that actually affects the performance of organizational and the team performance. That's your fully mediated side of things, right? So it's a third party effect that is actually changing your organizational performance and team performance, which is the flexible infrastructure. And even if you're on a hybrid cloud environment, it's still the same thing. Your team performance still requires your flexible infrastructure, and your operational performance still requires that flexible infrastructure for you to get that benefit of using either hybrid or public clouds. Now, of course, when you start going to multi-clouds and or private only, then you get that it is a more direct effect to the various performances, right? It's only a partial mediated by flexible infrastructure, but it's still something that you want to think about because ultimately, if you want to move into a more public or hybrid um, approach, then that flexible infrastructure is going to certainly help you. Um, so maybe I should take a minute to talk about what do I mean by flexible infrastructure? What do we mean by flexible infrastructure? And it really is having an approach that matches the definition of cloud computing by NIST, right? So a couple different key points. On-demand self-service, so you be able to provision your compute resource as needed without human interaction. So that is that flexibility of the developers. Resource pooling, let's say, for example, right? Multi-tenant models, physical and virtual resources dynamically assigned on demand. There is that rapid elasticity. So if there's anything that capabilities that is needed, peak performances and things like that, it could be quickly provisioned, rapidly scaled outward or inward on demand. So you're not having unused compute, and also measured service. So having metrics of performance, measures of resource usage, all that. And these are things that you would need as capabilities for your flexible infrastructure. And these are some of the things that here at Mirantis we could actually assist with as well in terms of provisioning of compute provisioning of Kubernetes clusters. Let's say, for example, we do measurement. We'd also have, through things like cluster API being provision infrastructure as needed, whether it's public or hybrid. So that's one of the things that you will need to think about. And so for those of you that are perhaps in the journey of your application modernization and are running into bottlenecks, or when you're those of you that are just starting off and wondering about what are other folks doing, the stats are actually a bit I don't want to use the word depressing, but it's a bit concerning when you think about it. So by another research, 79% of application modernization efforts actually do fail. And some of the reasons for failure are noted over here. So, these failures do come at a cost, right? The efforts cost upwards of $1 million or more, averaging nearly at $1.5 million. And the reasons for failure, there's a couple different areas, and I want to talk about that a bit later, and then talk about some of the things that were remediated. Maybe look at the timeline that it takes for application modernization as well. It's pretty heavy lift in terms of the timeline. So nearly 3 in 5 software and architecture leaders say that a typical application modernization schedule timeline takes well over a year, averaging about 16 months to about over a quarter say it takes about 2 years or more. One customer that we actually worked with said that if they actually were planning for a 3-year or more application modernization timeline, because that is the level of effort that they've estimated that you need to go through. And if you look at the actual specific reasons that some of the folks state, if you look at on the executive side, so on the strategy side, failed to accurately set expectations is one of the main responses that is coming back from the executives. Whereas from the architect side, when we're talking about at a more technical level, a lack of intelligent tools is one of the main reasons that are um, kind of pointed to as why the monetization efforts fail. And then we look at the second most cited reason is the cost associated with it, right? You got to throw human costs in there. You have to factor for the time. You have opportunity costs as well, because when you take your engineers off of value, well, quote unquote, value providing activities, building new applications, building new functionalities that are customer facing, and then move them onto addressing technical debt in your application modernization, that's an opportunity cost. And on the architect side as well, there's skills or training, because some of the things may be more siloed information. They could have been antiquated information, right? The folks that are working on the code may have left or move on to other areas. It's too complex. Again, there are many applications that perhaps you need to modernize, and with different technologies, at different ages, and so on. And again, the expectations. So That then comes to the big question that everybody's asking, right? When we talk about application modernization, and we've spoken to hundreds of customers, worked with them on their application modernization efforts, we see a common pattern. Um, Most folks have, like yourselves, hundreds of thousands of applications or products that need to modernize, right? And they've been around for years. They've been holding up the business for years. They're the backbone. But the problem is they've been kind of deteriorating in quality and fitness. There are, older technologies, older architectures. There's technical debt that we haven't been able to address because we're moving so fast on addressing new challenges, new capabilities, new functionality. So the transformation, in order to unlock that innovation, we have to go back and kind of break down things that have been working for ages. That it's kind of stopped working, but it's still holding it up. So we don't want to break things that's working, right? So it is hard. It's going to be grueling. You have to look through lots of documentation that may not be there, right? There, you may have to look at source code that is perhaps haven't been touched for quite some time, and you may need to talk to people that are no longer with the company, or have again moved on to other areas of the company and are working on high value projects. So you can't really take their time away. So where do we start? How what applications do we start and things like that. And then the dilemma as well is because of that limited resources and the amount of information that you have to process, how do we balance our business fitness, or how do we aim to increase our business fitness, the reduce cost, and increase our technical agility? Which one do we approve first, right? And so assessing that portfolio must involve both a technical view, but also a business view to look at what changes needs to be supported, right? And these are the things that we find are the highest value items to focus on in application modernization. So your assessment really needs to be efficient in identifying and prioritizing the opportunities when collaborating with all your business stakeholders, right? Your business folks, the IT folks, perhaps in vendors if you're using cost applications. So to address that, we've came up with a framework, and that is the Mirantis application migration and modernization platform, right? So it is meant to be able to assess the portfolio health, aid the analysis and prioritization of your applications that are needed to be modernized. Okay, so AMP offers a framework that essentially has been honed throughout the years that are working with customers. It's aligned with our zero ops strategy to eliminate the complexity and the heavy lifting on your part, right? So we kind of do the apps, we do the ops and the heavy lifting, so you can actually focus on your applications. So a few criteria that AMP must address. So of course, it must be lightweight and quick, right? It must be platform and infrastructure agnostic. So whether you're on Linux, you're on Windows, you're on VMs, bare metal, cloud infrastructure, doesn't matter. We should be able to address it. It needs to be fully automatic in order to scale it across hundreds, if not thousands of applications. So if there's too many human touch points, again, that takes resources away from perhaps higher value projects and then puts it into that the modernization effort. So we have to look out for that. Other things that we need to look out for, it must not depend on agents to be installed on your applications because then that changes the application behavior. So we want to act as a bystander looking into your application without actually changing anything much on the infrastructure itself or on the application stack itself. And it needs to discover and assess applications on hosts, sort them by complexity and business priority, giving you that view into what should go first, right? And not only does it perform a deep dive analysis into the application, more importantly, it should automate the transformation from whatever it is into Kubernetes and containers. So this way, we get them closer to a 12-factor app, right? So, knowing how things work is one thing, but it needs to, if you still have to do the work to lift it, that's a problem. So we want to automate that process for you as well. So using that framework and strategy, we've been able to speed up containerization by 6 to 10 times compared to earlier manual approaches. And from here, with integrations into CI/CD and testing, we also have a clear, repeatable path to microservices. So this is an actual customer timeline that we've established. And actually, this is a project that's already been completed. So the customer remarked this, we've actually saved them 20,000 hours, man hours. So that is more than 2 years worth of time in terms of the application modernization. Right. So we actually were able to achieve the modernization plan, get things into containers and deploy them to Kubernetes within a year, as opposed to prior. And they said, we budgeted 3 years for this, right? It would have perhaps taken us more because we have folks that we need to balance between different projects. So that actually went through. We actually modernized, we assessed 700 application, modernized a great majority of them within that year as well. So this is, you see the different phased approach, and we'll talk about the individual, the details of those phases in the following slides as well. Now, the approach that we take when modernization is on 4 different layers, right? So it's not enough just to look at the applications. We also need to look at the things that support that application. So within the application, the things that you want to look at is the architecture stack assessment. How do we then take that, Dockerize it, and operationalize it? And then we need to automate the building and testing. So this way your processes can run over and over again with stability and consistency. So this way you're not testing your pipeline. You're confident about your modernization process. So you could focus really on the applications. Um, and then, so with that, we need to make sure the pipeline is operationalized for scale. So when you have, let's say the previous example, you have 700 applications, when we should modernize it, your pipeline needs to support that as well. So your deployment pipeline needs to be, again, repeatable processes and able to scale for deployments. It needs to be secure. So we make sure that security is built into the processes, right? Checking for security scans, looking for CVEs, making sure that we don't have any that go into the processes. We also look at things like policies and configuration to make sure everything's up to speed. And then provide a pipeline acceptance. So once that's checked off, then we need the platform to support that. So things that you'll need to look at, and we help with that as well, is your platform operation model, right? How does that integrate with existing infrastructures? How do we make sure your platform has high availability? And how do we account for disaster recovery? And also things such as, how do your teams request your platform, access to your platform, scaling to your platform, compute resources, how that works. And last but not least, also the governance model, right? So look at things such as, what is your service operating model? All right, those are things that we want to think about as well. Having perhaps a center of excellence or a center of enablement, right? Taking a more federated approach to enable individual teams on being able to utilize the platform. They may not need to know everything about Kubernetes, but at least how to request for resources, depending on your governance model, and how to deploy onto those resources. If you have a pipeline set up already for that, again, we can help with those. And then evangelizing your platform, the internal marketing. How do we make sure that we've got this excellent area set up? How do we make sure teams are actually being onboarded? How do they know about it? How do we educate them? So these are things that think about and we could assist with as well, right? So getting into the nitty gritty, it's essentially, think of it as an 8-step approach for the first iteration, right? Covering the 4 work streams of application, your platform, your governance, and your pipeline, right? Not necessarily in that order, but it's a list of activities going all the way from assessment of your applications to looking at what goes first. Then you start containerizing them, looking at your governance model, making sure that your platform is ready, and then start deploying, right? And going through this process over and over again. Want to achieve, it's almost like a factory model that we want to achieve. So if you look at this individually, then the way this works is in the assessment phase, we'll start by looking at a workload analysis and then running our X-ray tools within the services to look at the way that applications work, right? Individual interactions between different components of your applications, what are some of the configurations that are required, and so on and so forth, right? And then with that, provide intelligent recommendations on technical difficulty, business value, any requirements on platforming, any requirements perhaps on licensing, all of that is being provided within the recommendation side of things, along with our Mirantis service recommendations from our years of experience modernizing applications. How could we also look at making the application more suitable for cloud environment, right? So the goal here really is to leave you with the most standardized, controllable, and operationally efficient software base and environment, and to really make it easy for you to use the apps that we modernize in multiple or future environments, right? One of the things that a lot of our customers are looking at, and then the first step is always moving to a public cloud, but a lot of our folks are now looking at more of a hybrid cloud vision. So we build everything to run essentially on any CNCF certified Kubernetes um, distros, right? Paying strict attention to make sure that there's no inconsistent functions between distributions, and then staying away from features that we know that we may deprecate in the future. So if there's anything in the Kubernetes list that is bound for deprecation or looks like there's another different type of feature coming out, we'll make sure we avoid that when we're looking at the refactoring of your application code as well. So with that, we create blueprints of the different application architectures depending on the outcome, the result of what we find, right? Should we just rehost it? Should we replatform it? Should we refactor the binaries? And from there, create a blueprint and using the tools, being able to modernize over and over again, right? So once we have the foundational uh, processes in place, you could then employ a factory model of modernizing your newer applications, any updates that can repeat over and over again, and makes it a lot easier and quicker for you to work with. Okay. And as we run it, like I said, we run it many different times because application modernization isn't a one-stop effort, right? So especially when you have an older application, we run it once to see what type of information it comes back with, how it can be enriched if we provide AMMP. And if I put more information into our process, our tool, perhaps we could access some permissions in controlled ways to broaden the scope of the analysis. So this way we could see, let's say, for example, an application is talking to some IP address, right? And we don't have access to that. We want to make sure that we know what it's talking to, right? For example, if that service is, let's say, a time server sitting on that IP, then maybe, that's something that we don't really need to look out for. Um, we know what it's trying to do, but if it's talking to something else, we need to see, should we make that part optimize as well and modernize as well, so that once we modernize your application and scale it up, would it create another bottleneck on the dependent services? So after we're performing the initial discovery steps, we actually talk to you and finding out everything we could do about the design of your target platform, right? So this way we then inform it back in the tool and provide better recommendations in the tool. Okay. So making sure that we're very accurate in our scope, our phases, and then in the estimation of the requirements and also ultimately your costs. And over here, so you see the processes over here are the individual steps that perhaps would go through to modernize the individual applications. So with the tool then, like I said, it should do a couple of different things, right? One, it should give very detailed explanations on what your application is trying to do. It should provide recommendations, and it should automate the process. So within our X-ray tool, this identifies its local and remote dependencies and connections. And that's important because the tool breaks the paralysis around not knowing exactly how things work. You may think about, I want to modernize this thing, but if I change this, would it break some other component? X-ray gives you a full picture of the dependencies of your application, who else it's talking to, are there any attributes, what's the background technology, all that is being laid out in a very detailed technical practitioner's report. So this way you have a background information on what's going on in your applications. In addition, so we're talking about, remember the architecture view and the business owner's part of view. So on from the architecture view, there's two complexity that we addressed through X-ray. There is the intelligent tools we addressed through X-ray. But then on the business view, what are the priorities? Where do we move first? What applications do we work with first? Do we want to look at cost? Do we look at technical complexity and things like that? So then we have a more strategic view from X-ray as well, looking at the different applications we rank it by how difficult they'll be to modernize uh, in different criterias. So with this way, we produce a simple plan for grouping them and handling them efficiently. We also provide recommendations on things such as which one should we work with first in terms of your risk, whether through application architecture risk or security risks, or things such as licensing risks, right? So all that will be provided in the report. And in terms of the technical side of things, we rank them by a 12-factor list and criteria to make sure that we build good cloud native applications. So this way, you know, the more factors an application is aligned with the 12-factor app list, it is easier for us to modernize. The less it is, obviously, there's more effort involved. So this way, you can make choices that make sense for yourself. Right? If it's pretty high on the list, maybe we can modernize them first, get them out of the way, and then start working on the higher uh, difficulty lists moving forward. Right. So when you look at um, cloud migration or cloud optimization, there is the number of R's framework, right? So of course, it started off with the 5 R's of cloud migration. So we have, depending on what you want to do, not Amazon has their 6 R's, and then some folks have 7 R's. But we think the 5 R's is the most fundamental, the most basics that we look at, right? So there are potential different paths that you can follow with the 5 R's. You could rehost some of the applications and just move them to new infrastructure. We could replatform it, right? Replacing a host operating system or move from a web application to containers without changing much about how it works, right? In some cases, we may need to refactor to remove some technical debt, improve non-functional aspects of the app, right? How you scale it, how you update it, improving your performances. Of course, there could be applications that it really makes no sense to work on. So you may want to postpone work on that for either business or technical reasons. And our report actually provides recommendations on those as well. And then those we could either retain and just leave as is, or retire and have more greenfield applications that replace it. We could also rewrite legacy applications as well from scratch for cloud native platforms. So these are things that we could actually assist with as well. Although this is, of course, a longer process, but we actually with reverse engineering, requirements validations, other steps. But these are things that we actually have done before as well. So when you're going through these, the different R's are obviously going to be a consideration when you're looking at these. But and again, the priority of here is really how do I take the applications that we have, right, the hundreds and thousands of applications that are currently there, and put them into one of these 5 buckets. Okay? So AMMP will be able to help you with that process of modernizing and classification of your applications. And want to make sure also that the use cases will be wide, right? Legacy applications could be in multitudes of technologies on multitudes of operating systems going back. So MMP actually supports multiple use cases, right? Anywhere from your typical, JBoss or your WebSphere, WebLogic applications on Linux, to your Windows IISs or AIX. When you're on Linux, you also have more basic database services, Nginx. So all that is being supported within application modernization platform. And also, you don't need source code access. We are able to analyze the actual applications itself while they're running. And when you have a large scale application, so this will be kind of localized when we're talking about things, right? We're looking at a set of applications within one business group, but rarely when you're looking at modernization, is it localized to just one area. So some situations, if it's a smaller project, it's pretty simple. But when you have larger scale modernization efforts, we have multiple business units. Each of them have their applications. In that situation, we plan transformation in waves. We call them waves, um, based on technical relations between the applications or customer priorities. So the way that our processes and the tool is set up is we actually can account for individual waves, group them into a logical group, and then within that have multiple applications. So this way, every group gets appropriate attention. They all see the results, and things aren't in a cross. So we're not again paralyzed by what are the interdependencies by the different groups. And as always, we recommend thinking strategies and we want to make sure that we have maximum practical impact in the shortest possible time. So tooling helps with this, right? So when we look at the discovery phase, um, um, you know, may have two legacy applications, say for example, pretty monolithic applications on each of the legacy applications, so monolithic processes and a database, right? And each application stands relatively alone. Although the code shows they may be sharing two of the three processes, but because with AMP we could see their interdependencies, we could recommend that a multiple transformation process to convert perhaps each of the processes into a container, refactor them. So this way they all share an individual database instance. So we don't have to refactor two applications individually, and then have it automated, right? So this way you get efficiencies of scale as well, right? So then we start factoring those out into new microservices, reducing the complexity, increasing the reusability. So, one step at a time, right? Using the strangler pattern, looking at things that we could actually take on, making them into microservices, and then start moving on into other areas until they're all microservices. Okay. So this is our iterative transformation approach going through. Um, App again is a combination of both tooling to make sure that you have automated processes that help you along the way, along with services to help with the resource constraints that you may have, right? Balancing folks that are working on high value projects versus the modernization projects. Application modernization and application development is part of our services offerings that will help you with that, but it's also part of a wider range of the services offerings that Mirantis can provide in terms of managing Kubernetes, perhaps looking at your development pipeline, deployment pipeline with guaranteed outcomes. And also, if you're a customer of ours, you probably have already experienced our Obscure and Obscure Plus services, where we could actually help you run your infrastructure or co-pilot your infrastructure management, where you could actually look at, hey, what's going on in there? You may need to look at these areas, or we could actually fix the issues for you and say, hey, we've already done, right? And all that goes into the Mirantis's zero ops container offerings, where we have our container runtime, which runs the microservices um, uh, workloads that you will have once your application is modernized. On top of that, we could orchestrate that using the Mirantis Kubernetes engine or K0s, which is more lightweight and works on both server environments and also edge environments. We have our deployment pipelines through Lagoon and then management through Lens and Lens App IQ, helping you with your application delivery processes, visualization, governance, which kind of goes back into the flexible infrastructure of self-service of your infrastructure and also the monitoring of your infrastructure. And then we secure your workloads through the Mantis Secure Registry, where your containerized workloads can then be scanned, have policy guards around security, and deployed into your environments. With that, I invite you to visit our website at www.mirantis.com, where we have information about the application modernization and migration workflow. But also, I put a little link over here, which is kind of our mini course on converting monolithic applications to microservices, where we actually outline a number of steps that are needed and are important for you to go through when you're doing your migration. And then we also have an ebook that you could download with the different things that you want to look at, from virtualization to microservices as well. So these are things that would help you hopefully along the way of application modernization. And of course, we're there to help you out as well. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to all of us to discuss your scenarios, perhaps the bottlenecks, what you're thinking about, and we're more than happy to help you out there in the process. So I think we'll leave it at that. I'll give you some time back in your busy, busy day. Can appreciate you joining us for this webinar over here, and hope you a great rest of your day. Take care, everyone.